Hello everyone and welcome once again to the NPC Dungeon. Once again, I'd like to announce that I decided to go ahead and label all my episodes, so my story episodes have the word story in the title, and my GM advice episodes now have the phrase DM advice in the title. This, again, is to make things a little easier for you to find. Once again, as I announced in my other episode this week, I published 2 episodes this week. The other is a continuation of last week's stories, so if you haven't heard that one, please go ahead and do that. I highly recommend you go ahead and do so and check it out. It's pretty funny in my opinion. Last week I also posted an episode about what we can do as players to help the game run a little more smoothly. All too often we want to leave that task completely to the DM, but there are some things we can do as players as well. Check that one out if you're curious. But this week I'm talking about one of the many nightmares that DMs or really any creative person might have. I know I certainly do, and that is confidence in your own work. So let's learn something. If you're anything like me, it's a very rare day that you make something that you're genuinely proud of. When I create something, I see all the little flaws in it, and I know how it could be better. And as a DM, that habit still persists. Before I run an encounter, I'm always unsure about how it'll go. And when I finish the encounter, I'm always convinced that it fell flat, or that my portrayal of an NPC wasn't as good as it could have been, or something else like that. And sure, you could argue this drives you to improve, but without confidence in your work, how can you have any fun? And really, it's a game after all. The goal here is to have fun. Plus, I find that the more confident I am, and the more comfortable in my skill set that I am, not only as a DM but in general, the better I do what I'm doing. So what do I do? All wordplay aside, let's start out with what I don't do. And to do that, we need to take a look a little bit at where this self-doubt comes from. I like to look at social comparison as the culprit here. If you don't know, social comparison is a concept in psychology that says that a person's self-image comes at least in part from the people they compare themselves to. And I'd say this applies not just to DMs, but really to any creative individual, because when we look at our work and say this is good or this is bad, we can only say this in comparison to something else. Really, we can only say anything as anything relative to something else. So, as DMs and GMs, we need to know what or who we're comparing ourselves to. And that's my first tip. Identify who or what you're comparing yourself to, because you always are, I can guarantee you. Know the standards that you're holding yourself to. And I'm not just using a cliche here, that really is half the battle. Often, we're holding ourselves to high standards, and we don't even realize it. And if we do realize it, we may not even know who or what we're comparing ourselves to, or why we're even doing it in the first place. So let's start with that. Maybe there's a movie or a show that you really like that's similar to your campaign, or that you took inspiration from for your campaign. You may look at your dialogue for your NPCs or your inciting incidents for your quests and adventures and wonder why it isn't at that same level as the show or movie or book or whatever. Well, it isn't going to be. It's a different form of media. Remember, D&D is largely improvisational and done on the spot. Encounters never go how you expect, and NPC personalities will sometimes run away from you, and that's fine. That's the nature of the game. Don't compare yourself to any other form of media. If you do, you will always fall short. But I also want to give a word of warning when comparing yourselves to the same form of media. I also want to say, don't compare yourself to the greats. This is something that I did for the longest time and I didn't even realize it. No matter who you look up to, whether it's Critical Role's Matt Mercer, Dimension 20's Brendan Lee Mulligan, or whoever, you have to keep in mind these people are actors and professional DMs who literally do this for a living and have been for a very long time. You can't expect yourself to do things the same way they do, nor should you. You have to find your own way of doing things that works for you. Otherwise, you're just imitating someone else and you'll never be as good as you could be anyway. But I'm not saying don't learn from them. Far from it. I can't tell you how many things and tricks I picked up from watching them. One of the reasons why I do watch them is to learn and see what they do, so that when I do notice any shortcomings in my style, I can gain a new tool to incorporate into how I do things. I love to learn from them, but I don't hold myself to their standards. I don't try to be like them, and I don't compare myself to them. I'm a different person, and I'm going to do things differently than they do. And that brings me to my next point. Understand who and where you are as a DM. There are times to learn from other people because the things they do represent an improvement on your style. And there are other times when those things that they do just don't work for you, either because you or your group simply does things differently, or because of where you are as a DM and your experience as a DM. Some things just may be too advanced for you to try out, and it's up to you to figure out which is which. On one hand, you don't want to be someone who never tries out anything new because, quote, it doesn't work for me. How can you know if you don't try? You're not perfect. You're going to do things that don't work, and you have to be okay with that. Otherwise, you'll never improve. If you expect yourself to do do things perfectly, it should be no wonder when your confidence suffers because you can never reach perfection. You need to make mistakes, you need to learn, and you need to be okay with that. On the other hand, you also don't want to be someone who constantly follows every new fad or idea that every other DM you see online says simply because they might be more experienced than you. Some will work for you and other things won't. Feel free to, and definitely do, try out new methods and styles and things, but follow your own creativity as well. That's part of confidence. As I said earlier, you need to know when to do things your way and when you assimilate other methods into your style. It's all about how you incorporate them, and it all seems to me to start with how you hold yourself to these unrealistically high standards. But you also have to know a little bit about where you're at as a DM as well. That helps you paint what standards you need to be holding yourself to. In my episode on how I plan encounters, I talked in a little bit more depth about what this means for me. My first campaign that I ever ran was really just a long fetch quest. It wasn't that great. I eventually became more ambitious, too ambitious really, creating huge worlds and multiple plot lines and not really knowing what to do with them. So I dialed back a little bit, worked my way back up, and now I am at that point where I can handle these huge worlds and different plot lines. My style now, as I mentioned in the episode I alluded to a second ago, is very much like an episodic series that starts out with events and encounters that are seemingly unrelated, but then converge until you're completely immersed in the main plot. For my next campaign I run, I'm going to do something a little more subtly different. I'm going to try to make it a lot more well-contained, with the main plot, while maybe not completely obvious from the very beginning, is definitely present from the very beginning. If I had tried this earlier, it wouldn't have worked. I needed to make these massive ambitious ideas and campaigns in order to get to this point, but not everyone does. Not everyone follows that same progression, and also not everyone will want to run things the same way that I do, and some people may not be very good at some of the things that I excel at, just like I struggle with some things that other people really excel at. That's what makes everyone's style so unique and different and so worth learning from, because someone else may think of a solution that's perfect for you and that just simply may never occur to you. Don't expect yourself to be perfect. You never will be. You're always going to have areas to improve in. Plus, there's not just one definition of perfect. For example, some people love Critical Role, others don't care for it. You need to know what works for you and where you need to improve in so that you can set realistic standards for yourself, like I said earlier, and realistic expectations for yourself, like I said earlier. In short, give yourself a break. Don't take it too seriously. And this goes very well with my next point, which is have fun. I get it. We all want to improve, but don't force it. I think it's best to let this happen naturally. Do you think I would have gotten where I am today if I just tried to skip ahead to the end? No, not at all. I just did what felt natural to improve. I saw problems that kept coming up in my DMing, and I took measures to fix them. For example, large-scale social interactions in cities and such were very difficult for me early on, so I dipped my toes into the water and started making city-like interactions with monsters that lived in massive dens, villages of nomadic tribes of kobolds, for example, and towns, until I realized that isn't that scary? And it all comes down really to having an image in your head and stuff with which to populate that image. Once I realized that, it got much easier. But that's all I'm going to say about that though, because I wouldn't be able to do that topic very much justice unless I covered it entirely in its own episode. So be on the lookout for that one. Plus, it's not really under the scope of today's topic. So let's get back to talking about taking yourself too seriously. The other side of the harm that taking yourself too seriously can do involves sucking the fun out of the game. Keep in mind, things don't have to go a certain way. Actually, it's probably best if you don't try to force things to go in a certain way. Otherwise, you run the risk of just leading the party along by their noses and taking away all their agency. In that case, they're not playing a game, they're completing a task that you put in front of them, and that's not fun. The unexpected is just one of many things that's just part of it. And like I said earlier, that's just something that we need to accept if we want to be happy with our skills as DMs. It's a little more difficult this way, but trust me, constantly trying to force things to go a certain way or doing whatever it is that seems easier on the outset is not how you improve your confidence. It's how you lock yourself in a little box. Completely avoiding self-improvement is not a way of avoiding the stress that comes with it. To avoid that, all you need to do is relax and realize that what you're doing is playing a game where you and your friends pretend to be wizards and knights and gnomes, slaying dragons and fighting goblins. We all want to improve, and definitely do improve, but you can do both. You can improve and have fun. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. Laugh at your mistakes and see what you can do to do it better next time. Let this happen organically. If your goal is to have fun, getting better at DMing will allow you to have more fun, so it should be a natural occurrence. And that process itself should be fun. I enjoy seeing my errors and mistakes, not just in DMing, but in a lot of things, because that means that I'm good enough to recognize where I'm going wrong. Doesn't that show improvement in and of itself? Once you start to see it that way, you'll realize that mistakes should actually boost your confidence a little bit, and all those things that you once saw as bad or losing aren't actually so bad. And I think, after all that being said, we can go back to social comparison for a second. Earlier, I said not to compare yourself to the greats, and this is true. It's probably best not to compare yourself to the greats, but do observe them. And I don't just mean to say this so that you can learn and realize where you might be going wrong or where you could stand to improve, but you can also use this as a tool to discover where you might be going right and where you might be doing well. Go back to whomever you idolize as a DM and watch them work. I guarantee you'll see them doing some things that you do well. Maybe they use a quest hook that you like to use, or they play an NPC in a way you like to do, not because you picked it up from somewhere, but because you just realized one day that it works. And even if you did pick up certain things from other places, it still takes a certain level of skill to pull it off in practice. Watching other DMs do the same things that you do in the same ways that you do in the same level of skill that you do is one of the most gratifying things that you may experience as a DM. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you may have a problem that you really struggle with and can't get past, and this can really take a toll on your confidence as a DM. When you see other DMs in action, you may see them dealing with the same issue and realize that whatever problem was plaguing you before does not mark the end of the world. All DMs stumble and make mistakes, and that's really easy to say, but it really does mean something quite different when you actually see it happen. But you shouldn't only observe these outside sources. You shouldn't limit yourself to other DMs. The problem with that is that they can't give you feedback, and feedback is important. My next point is just that. Get feedback from your players. But I know what you're thinking. But you already talked about improvement. I get it. Improvement in confidence is a false dichotomy. Well, first, I would say for one thing, well worded. And for another thing, very true. I'd also say that I'm not quite done talking about self-improvement yet, but not just now. You see, feedback isn't just about self-improvement. You generally ask your players how you're doing in order to see if they have any recommendations or ideas that can help them and to help you have more fun and ultimately help you become a better DM. Because yeah, you're in your head. You need that outside input. But that's assuming all your feedback will be areas for you to improve in. Notice I didn't call it negative feedback, and that's your first mistake. Don't assume that all your feedback is going to be negative. Even when people offer improvements, you have to choose which ones you listen to and which ones you don't. But there's also positive feedback, and this is just as important as the more negative side of feedback. It's just as important to know what you're doing well as it is to know where you could stand to improve. And this isn't just for the sake of becoming a better DM. I can't tell you how gratifying it is when one of my players tells me they're looking forward to D&D or that they had fun. It truly is one of the best, if not the best, confidence boosters there are out there. And if you're a player listening to this, if you're having fun, don't be afraid to let your DM know. What you see is completely different from what they see. They won't always know what kind of job they're doing, so let them know. And let them know what they're doing right and why you're having fun too. But remember earlier when I said I wasn't quite done talking about self-improvement? Well, my last and probably briefest point is going to be all about another one of those great increasers of self-confidence that's right up there with feedback. That's practicing. I know, the best way to increase your confidence in anything is to practice. And I also know, yes, it does kind of sound like a cop-out answer, but hold on for a moment. There's a reason why I ended up mentioning self-improvement so much in this episode. That's because self-improvement and increasing your confidence are so interconnected, and it isn't hard to see why. As I said earlier, the more confident you are in your craft, the better you'll be, but the opposite is also true. The better you get at it, the more confident you may also be as well. And that is a wonderful little coincidence and a beautiful cycle. Now, the scope of this episode does not include how to improve, so I'm not going to mention it here. Instead, I'll refer you to literally any of my other episodes on DM advice. However, what I will say here is that I understand not everyone has a group to play with, but while it is easier to improve by actually playing, it's not the only way. When I said in the trailer that I've been doing this for about 5 or 6 years now, do you think that's 5 or 6 years straight? No, definitely not. When I wasn't DMing, I was reading about it, preparing, and coming up with campaigns, encounters, characters, and other such things, and watching shows like Critical Role. I did this simply because I enjoyed it, but it also helped me to improve quite a bit. This is again what I mean when I say let this kind of thing happen naturally and let it happen organically. But that's it for now. As always, thanks for listening to this episode. Be sure to come back next week for the final iteration of the story of Bonk for now, and for an episode on how to fully immerse your players more into the world that you build and the campaign that you run for them. Also, feel free to check out this week's story as well as any of my other DM advice episodes and stories. You can find this show pretty much wherever you get your podcasts, as well as the NPC Dungeon YouTube channel. And of course, until next time, let's learn something.